Hot on the heels of Final Fantasy VII Remake, Square Enix releases another ambitious remake of a classic, this time dating all the way back to 1995 with Trials of Mana, originally known as Seiken Densetsu 3 up until its re-release in 2019 with Collection of Mana. Hi there everybody, my name is Josepher and I would very much like to thank Square Enix for today for giving me the opportunity to play this game in order to bring to you my very first console RPG video review, and so let us see if this brand new, fully 3D and overhauled remake of the classic SNES title will appeal to fans of the series and newcomers alike. As I said previously, Trials of Mana was originally known as Seiken Densetsu 3 in Japan, released in 1995 for the Super Nintendo or Super Famicom, and was then finally brought over to Western shores last year in its original form with Collection of Mana. But Trials of Mana, as it is now, is completely overhauled with new graphics, new combat mechanics and new gameplay, and all sorts of new things to bring in new players and to appeal to its original fan base. Now the first thing that I noticed with around 12 hours of playing Trials of Mana is just how closely it follows the original game and resembles various events and things that happen in that title. From the dialogue, some of it is identical, to even the layout of various combat areas and towns. I could actually see from looking at it like where I remember things being from the original title. So you can easily see just how much reverence the development team has for that original 1995 title. Even the character designs look like they've been lifted straight out of the original box art for Seiken Densetsu 3, and honestly, I'm very much here for it. Those who have played the original game, therefore, will find a lot to love in this particular version of the game. Now, Trials of Mana gives you the option of selecting one of 6 main characters, so it works things out a little bit differently to most RPGs. So you have Duran the Warrior, Angela the Mage, Kevin the Beastman, Charlotte the Priestess, Hawkeye the Thief, and Reese the Amazon, and then it asks you to pick 2 more of those characters to take as your companions. And the story actually plays out differently depending on which of these characters you pick, including the primary antagonist for the story. Now you can't change party members after you've chosen these characters, so it's very important that you select carefully and select a well-rounded team off the bat. But basically what it means is that Trials of Mana actively wants you to play this game multiple times to experience all the different nuances of each character's story, and to be honest there is a lot to be said for just how many different interactions there are with the Mana world's various characters simply based on who you pick as your main character and as your companions. The story itself, being remade from a SNES game, is relatively straightforward. Each character's story starts in a different place, but ultimately they all converge on a quest to find the Sword of Mana to save the world from dying to the villains, specific to the characters that you've chosen for your party, as well as the Benevodons, which are 8 behemoths of destruction that were sealed away for thousands of years. The story is not exactly Final Fantasy VI levels of deep and complex. There's a lot of typical tropes that you would see in a lot of RPGs in this day and age. But given that the game hails from a time where simplicity was actively more appreciated, it certainly serves the function of telling a very nice, pleasant fairy tale story well. Now this is definitely a game that's aimed at players that are looking for a nostalgia trip rather than those looking for a massive AAA groundbreaking story experience, but for the right players, as I said earlier, they will find a lot to love in Trials of Mana. Now, Trials of Mana has been built up from the ground up in every aspect, and of course the first and most noticeable place to spot this is in the game's visuals. With new 3D, HD graphics, one might worry that this game would lose its charm from the original Seiken Densetsu 3, but worry not, because as I said, the game's art style is extremely charming, lifting those characters straight out of the box art from the original, in a very similar way actually to the visuals of Dragon Quest XI. The staggering amount of attention to detail in the character designs, as I said, they just look flawless. Like the actual visuals of these characters, I actually really love the art style that they've gone for. They've not gone for anything hyper-realistic. The cell shading works really, really well. And inserting them right off that box art into a brand new colourful world, the lighting is really pleasant, and fans of the original game will likely light up with glee upon seeing events unfold as they remember them, but within a new light. Having played both the Switch version of the game and the PS4 version of the game, there is a noticeable difference in crispness between the two, kind of making it look like the Switch version has almost like a little bit of Vaseline kind of spread over the lens, as well as there's a major frame rate difference between the two, with the Switch obviously being locked to 30 FPS and the PS4 being at 60. But quite honestly, unless you have the two games side by side, I personally didn't notice too much of a difference, certainly not enough to put me off from picking up the Switch version. Both versions also have slight frame rate issues when there's a lot going up on the screen, so when there's a lot of skills going off, attacks going off, lots of enemies on the screen. It does have the occasional hiccup, but nothing too dramatic. And then I also did notice the occasional sort of texture pop up here and there, but by and large, the actual graphics and fidelity of the game works very well on both the Switch and on the PS4. The music in Trials of Mana is positively delightful, remastering the original soundtrack with a full orchestral score and setting the mood for each of the game's various areas wonderfully. If you so choose, you are actually able to change the music back to its original 1995 soundtrack, but honestly, I enjoyed the new soundtrack more than enough to ever contemplate changing it back to the original. The sound effects are also really very pleasant to anyone who has played an RPG from the PS1 era or the SNES era or anything around that time, being practically identical to the originals when it comes to like menu sounds and things like that, but giving an updated weight to things like attack sounds and monster noises when it was needed. The voice acting, on the other hand, while I appreciate the huge amount of work and effort that has been put into fully voicing this game, given how many different cutscenes there are within the game's branching story arcs and how many different places different characters could be, the voice acting here ranges from fine to hilariously bad. Now, Kevin, who was the character I chose as my main character, being a beast man, is intended to have slightly broken English. However, instead of that, he kind of just comes off as a young boy who seriously needs to learn what the word syntax is.
Really make us tiny?
And then we have Reese here as well, who honestly doesn't even have the excuse of being a beast man and having the broken voices.
Welcome back. I am so glad to see you safe.
And then, while I very much appreciate the closeness to the original game's dialogue, I am not sure I ever need to hear Charlotte baby talking ever again. Luckily, if the voice acting is too grating, you can change the voiceovers to Japanese with subtitles, so that might be something that I will consider when playing on subsequent playthroughs.
A white, huh? It could be dangerous. I can't let Heath face it alone.
One major gripe I did have with the presentation of this game, which may not affect everybody, is that when skipping dialogue in cutscenes, instead of cutting to the first animation that happens at the end of that line of dialogue, Trials will instead skip to the first line after that line has been skipped. Which, as somebody who reads faster than the game speaks, I would much rather be able to skip the game's dialogue without feeling like I'm being punished after reading it by skipping out animations that are probably really important to the story. There were a couple of cutscenes where I skipped a bit of dialogue because I didn't want to wait until the character had finished their line and I'd already read it, and then something had happened and then they're talking about something completely differently. So I just thought, oh, hold on, what's happened here? So that's something I did have a little bit of an issue with when it comes to the presentation of Trials. So looking at the gameplay for Trials of Mana, I actually want to draw comparisons to another recent game made by Square Enix, which is obviously Final Fantasy VII Remake. So Final Fantasy VII Remake diverges very heavily from its source material in terms of gameplay. The way the game is played is really very different to its original. Instead of that, Trials of Mana sits on the opposite side of the remake spectrum and seeks to stay as true to its origin as possible while rejuvenating it to a modern standard. Now, we had this previously with 2018's remake of Secret of Mana, and it didn't come off very well because it was too close to its original, not giving any quality of life improvements, not anything like that, and it was just the original game with updated visuals. Luckily, Trials of Mana doesn't quite suffer as badly for that, but for better or worse, the game definitely sticks to its original formula as best it can, and it does so extremely well. The combat's actually very straightforward, action RPG fare, having light attacks on one button, heavy attacks on another, charge attacks that can break an enemy's shield, opening them up to further damage, and a list of special attacks or spells that can vary from character to character. I did find that with the characters and the classes that I chose, it took quite a long time for them, particularly Kevin, to learn any moves at all outside of the basic attacks, which kind of rendered his gameplay to a more simple, kind of repetitive Dynasty Warriors style affair, where I was just mashing light and heavy attacks in a very similar way to Dynasty Warriors, waiting for his chargeable class skills to become available so that I could then use that, and then I would repeat that ad nauseum for a few hours. But as the game progressed, I found that more options opened to me, maybe a little slower than I would have expected, but this issue became less and less of an issue as time progressed, particularly seeing as you can switch characters with a single button press, and you can use characters that do function very, very differently from one another over time. Flying enemies, I really did not enjoy very much in this game. The aerial combat, you are restricted to jump, light attack, or a heavy attack which brings you back down again. There's not a lot of variety when it comes to aerial combat, which is a shame. It felt very mundane, very inflexible, and the attacks themselves felt very rigid and unvaried, because I noticed that a couple of my characters actually had the same animation when it came to their attacks, and I also did notice as well that a lot of enemies in this game do get recycled quite a lot throughout the course of the game, which did bother me slightly. Those who know the game well will recognise elements of the combat straight away, such as the ring menu, which is a staple of mana games. It's always been there. It's a simple button press that brings up a little ring menu so that you can select any items or skills or spells that you want to use as soon as you can, and it pauses the action in order for you to do that. However, because Trials of Mana has a shortcut system, so you can assign 4 class skills and 4 items/spells to either L1 and R1 and a button press, or just L or R and a button press, and then you don't really need the ring menu once you start figuring that bit out, because once you've assigned those skills up, you just literally, it all just flows very, very nicely just using those. So I actually very rarely use the ring menu at all, except for when to use items. I did use it for that. One of my favourite things about Trials of Mana, and the Mana series in general, is the seamlessness between entering and exiting combat. There's no, loading screens between going into combat and exiting combat. There's no victory screens outside of bosses to see, so you still get the satisfaction of a victory screen, just not as frequently. And the display of experience or items that you gained is actually very, very clear. Reminds me a lot of Final Fantasy XII, if you've played that, or the Zodiac Age, where just going in and out of combat is very quick, very free, very seamless. You just continue running after the fight is finished, just as you did before you entered the fight in the first place, which makes traversing combat areas quite pleasant and very simple, very easy. The controls I found were very responsive, switching characters, using class skills is just a simple button press, and as I said, the shortcut menu actually makes things really, really simple and fun and friendly to use. It's very ergonomic and it works very well, giving some variety to the combat as well, but I did find myself button mashing on more occasions than one due to the effectiveness of just regular attacks. There were many, many fights where I'd just sitting there pressing A, pressing X occasionally, and just getting through combat very, very easily. The AI of the non-control companions is competent, with some customization options on how you would like the AI characters to function. So, for example, Charlotte, the white mage of the group, would cure at a decent enough time, but it would have been nice to have seen class skills used by them a little more often so that it wasn't so necessary to switch to characters repeatedly just to use the class skills one after the other in quick succession. Character progression in this game is something I both very much enjoyed with this game, but at times found slightly infuriating. The actual system for leveling is very intuitive, very fun, assigning points upon gaining a level for you to assign into one of 6 primary stats. Gaining skills, moves, depending on which stats you put the points into, some of which can actually be equipped by other party members, which gave a huge sense of customization that I appreciated. A lot of replay value right there, because you can build a character differently, even within the 6 that you've got. One playthrough you play as Duran and you play him as strength build, another you play him as a tank, and it actually works very, very well. However, some of the skills that you gain across the game are gained by talking to seemingly random NPCs with no indication from the game as to which characters actually give you those skills, meaning having to speak to every NPC in every town, most of which felt very superfluous, like giving single line answers and then nothing, in order to hunt some of these skills down, which was a little bit unnecessary. Weapons and armor can be found all over the place and all in treasure chests and in shops and things like that, but I never found these in general to be much more than simple stat upgrades, although I did appreciate, as I always do, visual upgrades on weapons. I always think that that's a great thing to have. Perhaps it would have been nice, however, to have seen these have additional effects or grant extra abilities. Perhaps abilities could have been moved from gaining them from NPCs over to weapons that you gain or things like that, but again, that would take away from the feel of the original. Class changes that come into the game relatively early on actually make a huge impact on character progression, with a semi-permanence that, with branching paths, so again, long for multiple playthroughs to see all the different skills and all the different costumes as well, because you can actually change costumes for the characters that are on offer for each character. In the original Seiken Densetsu 3, you actually couldn't change back after you changed class, but with Trials of Mana, you can, but there is some difficulty in doing so. So do take a moment before you decide which classes you want each of your characters to go. Also, I do want to quickly point out that any game that lets me jump and dodge in open areas just at random, at will, I always quite like, because I'm sure I'm not the only person who gets itchy fingers while running around and just has to press buttons, and it doesn't slow you down either, which is nice. In terms of replay value, it's extremely evident simply from the setting of the game that Trials of Mana is built to be played multiple times. From the diverging story elements that are granted by the game's varying main cast, to the semi-permanent class changes in the gameplay, to eventual endgame content as well. I have put over 12 hours into this game so far, and judging by the progression of the original Trials of Mana, I'm just over halfway into the story, having not stopped too frequently to grind or search for the game's little cactuses, which are something fans of the series should be familiar with, or exploring any additional content or anything like that. So there is a lot on offer here in terms of longevity. On the game's normal difficulty setting, I have very rarely encountered any major spikes or situations where I was struggling to progress, and leveling actually felt very natural, so I didn't really feel the need to grind in the first place. I progressed quite naturally, which I appreciated. But for those players who are looking for more of a challenge, there are hard mode settings from the get-go, so you could try that out and see if you prefer it that way. Put simply, as a fan of old school RPGs, I like Trials of Mana. It's very much on the opposite side of the remaking spectrum to Final Fantasy VII Remake, choosing not to completely redesign the core gameplay in order to cater to a brand new audience, but instead choosing to stay as true to its original formula as possible. Therefore, I believe that fans of the Mana series and of old school SNES and PS1 era RPGs will find a lot to love of in this remake, with reimaginings of classic characters and gameplay, as well as an absolute plethora of content to go through with it. But sometimes I think the game stays a little too close to its source material to a point of being stubborn. As I said earlier, it's certainly not as egregious as the remake of Secret of Mana in 2018, but there were still places in the game where I felt that it was getting a little bit repetitive, and some more variety a little bit earlier on would have been very much appreciated. So while I would definitely recommend this game to players of a certain type, I'm not sure I would necessarily recommend this game to everyone. Certainly not to those who have never played a JRPG before. That being said, in this day and age, sometimes it's really pleasant to go back to a simpler time and enjoy an RPG that brings the nostalgia home in a different way to remakes that we've seen in recent times. Do you plan to buy Trials of Mana? Do you plan to get it for the Switch or the PS4 if you do plan to playing it? Have you already played the demo? It's important to note that there is in fact a demo available on the Switch store and the PS4 store, so if you're not sure, you can always try the game out, and then the save, like Dragon Quest XI, will carry over to your main game if you decide to purchase the game. So I definitely encourage you to give the game a try and decide for yourself whether you like the game or not. As I said, sound off in the comments below and let me know what you think of the game itself and the demo and anything relating to Trials of Mana. So that's going to be it for my very first video review for Trials of Mana. Once again, I would like to extend a massive thank you to Square Enix for sponsoring this video and for allowing me to play the game in order to bring this review to you guys. And I would love to invite you guys to have a look at all of my social media links in the description box below, including my Twitter, my Twitch and Discord. Do let me know in the comments below if there's anything that you would like me to cover in the future. And of course, don't forget to have a look at my Patreon channel as well, where I make bespoke title cards to be put at the end of each of my videos for anyone who is kind enough to contribute to the channel further. And as with any of my videos, I always take the time to shout out a random patron for my video, and this time around it's going to be Onirio. Thank you ever so much for your support, and I appreciate every single one of you that comes to support this channel, and even everyone that comes to view the channel or any videos that I make, whether this be your first time looking at my channel or your 20 billionth. Thank you ever so much for joining me today. Don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and ring that bell for notifications for videos on Final Fantasy Opera Omnia and video game reviews and all sorts of fun things to be coming up in the future. Let me know what you think of the video in the comments below, and I will see you guys very, very soon. Thanks ever so much, everybody, and take care. Bye bye.